All right. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. Just a quick reminder for those of you that weren't in attendance, a video was sent out. That was a first grade video of implementing a learning plan. I tried to say in the email, I just want everyone to know, like, that wasn't a staged process. It wasn't him coming in to record you today. It was a walkthrough for a learning plan. The teacher had asked me to come in, and I just was really impressed with the variety of ideas and strategies that she was using. So I kind of stopped the walkthrough and just started hitting record. And pulled that together to share out because I just thought there are a lot of things to think about, in terms of ways to implement a learning plan for the first grade. Just a quick pop quiz. If I'm implementing a learning plan, does it have to be fully digital and on a Google Doc? All right, thank you. Just want to make sure that I said that in the very beginning. So you saw that here. I loved how one of the things that stood out to me was that on the slide deck that she had for evidence of learning, they could have, there were digital choices, but there was still paper and pencil, and the kids knew where they could find that in the classroom to go and pick it up. In fact, I didn't say this in the video, she even differentiated the evidence of learning. Like, she even said, this one's pretty easy. This one is a challenge. This one's a little bit tougher when it comes to knowing your fact triangle. I think I said that right. So she really laid that out for them, and several of the kids tried to take the harder option to kind of show that they really understood the concept. So just another way, and that's really a great kind of tie into our agenda here today. As you look at our outline, we're going to talk a little bit about the learning zone for just a second, or the zone of proximal development. And then really just that video is to kind of tee us up for like learning plan implementation ideas. Again, you guys are where the rubber meets the road for us. You are the ones that are doing this consistently in the classroom. And so we're just trying to pull together some ideas and different ways to make this work for your kids. And I hope that this time today is beneficial for everybody. Just a quick CPO, you can see it here. We used this CPO in the past, just a reminder that you are our teacher leaders, and we're just using this time to get together as architects, provide insight, share what's working, what's not. And specifically, like I said, for today, the expected outcome is just to have you thinking about different methods for implementation of the learning plan in your classroom, knowing that the core of all this is time, path, pace, and place for kids. So before I talk about the zone of proximal development, I just wanted to say this, and can I just hear from like 2 or 3 people quickly? Something that has come my way as a building administrator is some of the individuals that are not MLAs have said that the learning plans they're finding are slowing up their pace. They're struggling to stay on pace with where they believe they should be at this point of the year. Now, we know every year is different. Your learners are different every year. I was just curious if anyone could speak to that, to say, yeah, I'm really experiencing that, or no, that hasn't been the case for me. I've been quicker or where I expect to be. So Jeremy, I saw your hand was raised.
I think where it slows down the pace is the fact that you need to take the time to teach the soft skills. And when you start to get more comfortable with them, and I have not rolled out the way I wanted to roll out because I've been teaching the soft skills and the technology needed to complete. However, based on last year, once you do that, you gain time later. So yes, I'm not where I want to be with this particular kindergarten class, but I know that the soft skills that I'm laying down now are going to be used later, and that we will progress more rapidly then.
Yeah. Can you give me a quick example, Jeremy? Like, can you identify 2 or 3 soft skills that you've had to explicitly teach that we're kind of adding?
In kindergarten, you have all the SOPs of Chromebook handling, how to log in and problem solve there. And then the other thing, and I have spoken to Josh about this, are when we create these, we're all using the technologies we like. So if I'm going to Google it, Shazam it, do this, I'm going to spend months just teaching them how to use the technologies. So because we're given the opportunity, and it takes a lot of time, I may not be able to Jamboard it because my kids don't know that. I may have to adapt that activity to a technology that we're more comfortable with.
Perfect.
And it does take a little time, but I will say that was where I felt in the past I was being slowed down, but in the long run, I wasn't.
Got it. Thank you, Jeremy. That was really helpful. Anybody else? One more person? Anyone can add to that? I think you said it really well for us, Jeremy. Thank you. I just want to remind you, I don't know what the other buildings, that's a lie. I do know the other buildings. I wanted to say that, like, if you're experiencing a lot of quarantines, people that are being out, and, kids that are positive, keep in mind that back in the day when we started this process, we talked about learning plans helping us future-proof, because we didn't know what was coming up in the future. We didn't know, will we be in person? Will we be remote? And just, this concept, this format is why it's why we did what we did. We feel like this helps us deliver that instruction without being on top of a kid or just doing a Google Meet for an hour with a kid that's trying to learn from home right now. Being able to pull pieces of this learning plan to share with them, we hope, is trying to keep as best we can the continuity of education for sure. So, and that's a challenge. I know we all can acknowledge that. Before I turn things over here to Josh and Meg, I just want to remind everyone that this is the challenge that we face as teachers. If you haven't heard me talk about it before, it's called the zone of proximal development. And really what this is just a fancy way of saying, like, at the very bottom of this, you'll see the level of competence. That means like their skills, their abilities. And then on the y-axis, you see the level of challenge. And this idea being, if their abilities are on the lower end, it's very easy for them to enter into the anxiety level when the challenge is too great. And when their abilities are really high, it's very easy to enter into the boredom because the challenge isn't strong enough for them. And so, like, I know this, I can do this. This is a waste of my time. I'm checking out. Your challenge as educators is to find that zone of proximal development. And I provided 2 other graphics on this slide. It's saying the same thing, just in different ways. Maybe you connect with one over the other. But this idea of being in the learning zone, the zone of proximal development, where maybe with a little bit of help and scaffolding, I can get there. It's a little bit of a stretch, but with some practice, ultimately I become independent, versus this idea of constantly operating in the anxiety zone. And I think Jeremy was speaking to, you are operating in the anxiety zone for kids when you're telling them, create a Jamboard to do this, this, and this in kindergarten. And number one, they don't know what a Jamboard is. And number 2, they can't read or write yet. So that's putting them in the anxiety realm pretty quickly. And so it's just a reminder that why we use learning plans, and our goal as educators is to constantly work towards that sweet spot with our learning plans and how we're able to implement them with students. All right, Josh, take it from here.
All right, cool. So talking about that sort of sweet spot that Doug referenced, and you can watch that video. Doug put that into the link, and it's also in the slide deck for today that I'll make sure everybody gets. One thing to make sure that we're doing is utilizing a learning progression and not learning parts. And I know that sometimes it's easier for us to compartmentalize and say, okay, everybody go and work on this learn about it section, or everybody go work on this evidence of learning. And the idea is that we're trying to make learning constant and continuous. And hitting that zone of proximal development really stems from 2 things. One being students being able to like self-identify where they are in that learning progression. And then also having the tools and the means to start working towards mastering that level so that they can move on to the next. And so I think, I know for myself at least, especially in mathematics, when I taught up at the high school, it was easy for us to get into this objective-based mindset where we learn this, then we learn this, then we learn this, and it's very sequential, and it makes sense, but we're not able to keep that learning constant throughout the entire process. So instead of thinking of these things as like, oh, we're doing a pre-assessment and now we're doing learn about it section, now we're doing an evidence of learning, thinking about it more of a continuous measure of students are moving to and fro throughout this entire learning process, rather than just pinpointing in on 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. So how do we connect our learning, and how do we keep it constant? And the first thing is that I showed my wife this slide last night, and she said it scared her because of this. But the idea here is that we're not all the same. It's not like we're cloning all of our teachers and we're not producing the same exact classrooms, and everybody's classroom here is different. Everybody's, if you're in an upper grade, every period is different. Every set of kids is different. So what your students need is what they need. What you as a teacher need is what you need. So this idea, what I love about today is that we're going to show you, you've already seen one classroom in 1st grade. You're going to see from Megan a little bit what 3rd grade is doing to, again, sort of self-assess where students are on that learning progression, but also tailor the instructional process to what fits their classroom and what their needs their students are. So like Jeremy said about building those soft skills in the beginning, that looks very different from grade level to grade level. And that looks very different from teacher to teacher. So how you do it is how you do it. We're just making sure that we're still trying to keep learning constant rather than compartmentalized. So one way to think about this is that when we start using tools and technology, that's sort of our base layer. We're using those as our home base, whether those are resources in the classroom, whether those are online tools or strategies that you're using to teach your students. And what we need to start doing is making sure that everything is flexible, because we want students moving in and out of these different realms or different learning environments. Whether it is that independent time, whether that's that small group or direct instruction time, we need to make sure we have a flexible environment that supports a learning progression, not learning parts. And then also we need to make sure that we're using data, and I'll go over in the next slide what some of those data points are. And we have that qualitative and quantitative. And one other one that I threw on today is called reflective. And that's more for students to be able to resonate with the material that they're learning and be able to connect that to the learning progression so that they know what comes next in their pathway, whatever that pathway might be. So using data, instead of just taking data for data's sake, like we take a pre-assessment, it's not just to see how well they did in the post-assessment. It's guiding the instructional process throughout, from the very beginning to the very end. And then ultimately, this leads to that student empowerment that we're trying to seek within building that ownership of their learning, sitting in the driver's seat and driving what their education looks like in that classroom. So from the tools to student empowerment, we can utilize a learning plan and a learning progression to aid in that process of getting there. So just some data points to consider when you are doing things like flexible grouping or having students being self-reflective on the learning progression is, one, we look at that qualitative data. And I'd almost argue that qualitative data in most sense is the data that you're relying on the most, because you are constantly talking with your students, you're observing your students, you're seeing where they are, how they're feeling on any given day. If you have a student who walks in and they're bawling their eyes out, you know you're going to have to approach that student a little bit different than the student who might have been hyped up on sugar that day. So when they walk into the classroom, you're using that qualitative reasoning and that qualitative data to drive what that instruction is going to look like. We also have that quantitative data. We have those pre-assessments. Anytime we do check-ins or checkouts, we have now IXL or any other online platform that you're using with your students, any analytics to go with that, to not just do it just to say that you have data on your students, but use it to make those informed decisions. And then what I think is the most powerful and something that our students need to be trained on even more is this reflective data. And this is internalized by students. So their self-proficiency rating, how are they doing in the learning progression? If you walk up to a student and say, hey, what did you learn today? They might tell you like the tangible things, but they're not able to articulate how they're feeling about the concept. They're not able to articulate intellectually speaking or metacognitively speaking how they are doing in that progression to learning. And that's something that they need to be trained on. Because once they're able to do that, they're able to then, boom, go directly from how they're doing to what they're doing and make it a seamless transition. Student-led discussions are a great way to do that and a great way to model it. So you have students talking about it. And then metacognitive exercises that you can do with your students. And I can give you some resources of that, just having them think about thinking. And that goes back to growth mindset. So we've been doing those practices with our students, but really focusing in on this reflective piece so that they can move towards really understanding what they're learning, how they're learning it, and where do they go from next. So what I want to do is I'm going to send it over to Meg here, and she's going to share a little bit about what third grade is doing in a different way. But again, we're all different. We're not clones of one another. So it's fantastic. So Meg, go ahead and take it away.
All right. So I was working with Miss Snyder, who's one of our newer third grade teachers here at Canadockley, and she really wanted to see what it looked like to start implementing learning plans. She had done one in the fall, and there's some things that she wanted to change. One of my favorite things to do is to work with so many different teachers at different buildings, because I like having that pre-conference where we can talk about what the culture of the classroom is like and what the kids like to do, so we can really tailor what we're doing to your classroom. So the first thing that we did was like, well, we need our pre-test, and she's gave it last week. And after she gave the pre-test, what I did was I helped her create kind of a scoring guide. Nothing really robust or anything, but at least something where we can say what students are using or confusing or not yet using. And we did it for the developing and for the proficient levels. So we had the compare and contrast literature goal. So we had the learning goal stated for developing and for proficient, and broke it down just by, yep, I can do all of this, or maybe I'm using some elements of literature in the story elements, or we're seeing that they're just not yet using it. And then at the bottom of this sheet, we paste out where students might be as we're introducing the learning plan that's on Google Slides. So we started off with, maybe you're just going to be learning about it and developing, then practice it. If you think you're good with the developing level, you can do your evidence of learning, then moving on to the proficient, learn about it, practice it, and evidence of learning. So literally, we printed this out when we returned the pretest to the students the following week and just highlighted where they're at that time. So it would not only show where they're at if they were at emerging or beginning from their pretest, but also where they could start on their learning plan. And this is something that they keep with them in their folder. So as the teacher is working with them, or as they're working on their learning plan, they can continually highlight the next box that they're working on and moving on through those. So then we introduced to them their learning plan, which was on, she chose to use the template that Josh had shared previously this year. And it was easier because her students preferred using things in Google Classroom. It just seems like the more paper that was in the room, it was upsetting them. So like, this is just her culture. It doesn't mean if you have it on paper, that's fine. But this was just what made sense for her kids. She then made the link to each of the activities they could choose go straight to their Google Classroom. So when they clicked on the slide, it would just open up to their evidence of learning in the Google Classroom, so they could do that activity and turn it in. And once they turn it in, she can provide immediate feedback or start to pull some flexible grouping along the way. So what I helped her create was a Google Sheet then. And this Google Sheet has the responses of the students, so with how they did on the developing and proficient of the pretest, where they are in their learning plan right now, and a place for their post-test at the end. So when we talk about that qualitative and quantitative data that you're collecting, and that flexible data and meeting with the students, you can see that it's easy to now group the students based upon how they did on their pretest and know what they need. If we've got kids like, well, they can't identify the character of the setting yet. They're still struggling to read passages. So I know this group is going to be a group I need to work with a little more closely or one-on-one, versus maybe that middle group who's like, well, they sort of seem to know most of their reading elements. They're a little confused on theme, but they're definitely ready to move on to, after they get theme, to move pretty quickly on to the next part. So it's easy to group in the Google Sheet. If you keep track of it this way, you can just update as students are learning and working through their learning plan, so they know and talk to you about which part they're working on. And you can just duplicate this sheet for any learning plan you're working on. So you can just have one sheet that says what students are working on and where they are in their learning plan. So this was just one way that I was working with a teacher, just some examples. So if any of those documents you think would be helpful to you, there's some forced copies here for you. If you would like the learning plan data sheet, where you can keep track of your pre and post test scores and where students are in their learning plan, or if you liked the template of the scoring guide and you think that you could just totally use it to change the language depending on your learning goals, and use that kind of sheet for your students, if you think that'd be helpful, these should be forced copies.
So Meg, if I heard you correctly, when you were talking about the old template that Josh had provided on the Google Slides, just like the first grade teacher that I shared, she used her Clever to take her directly to the learn about it or the practice it. That is done with Google Slides in the third grade classroom. Like when I would click on that, it wasn't taking me to a Google Doc. It's taking me right to the practice it or the learn about it. Did I hear that correctly?
They get a copy. They have in the Google Classroom the learning plan. So it has all the slides. And when they open the slides, we talk about where they're going to start. So they know to go to
Right.
either the developing learn about it or developing practice it page, depending on where they're at. But when they click on the activities in the slide, it takes them directly to a place to turn it in Google Classroom.
Got it. Thank you. As I'm looking at your tracking sheet, like, again, in the video I had for first grade, hers was more paper and pencil, doing check marks, kind of seeing like what skills she's observing. Is it at the proficient level? This is a digital version that really breaks down the different categories based, and also with the inclusion of the pre-test, right? So that you have this way if you would prefer a digital over what was being done in the first grade classroom.
Okay, I'm posting in the chat right now. Some of you, it said it's requesting access. I just created 2 new copies, and these should be available for you. So they are in the chat right now. The first link is the tracking sheet, and then the second link is the learning plan pre-test scoring guide. And I'll update those in the slide deck then after we're done today, so that you have access to those as well.
Great.
All right, awesome. All right, so just as we're sort of closing out this morning, we talked about a lot. We shared 2 different examples of how learning plans are being incorporated, along with some of the resources that are being provided by those teachers. So just some things to keep in mind as we move forward, and maybe a couple of people can share out, or you can drop it in the chat what your thoughts are. So here are some questions. How do we make learning progressions consistent and constant? So instead of compartmentalizing those individual actions, we are truly looking at a continuous model of a learning progression. How do we empower students to take ownership of learning? How can we more effectively use data to drive instruction? And then how do we teach our students to be reflective learners? So if anybody would like to share, this is our checkout for today. Doug, did you have anything to add before we close things out?
No, I think that was well said.
All right. Awesome. So feel free to either drop it in the chat or unmute yourself and share out what your thoughts are on any one of these questions.
Well, I know one of the things that I saw where students were taking ownership of their learning is I'm hearing more and more teachers tell the students about the choices that they have on the learning plan. So when they say, well, right now you're focusing on your developing section, and these are pieces you need to teach. And even when I was in a 4th grade classroom, I would hear the teacher say, when they said, well, do we have to do everything? Do we have to click on everything and watch all the videos? They go, you decide what you need right now. And when we meet, we'll talk about that. And at some points, that created a lot of anxiety over that type of freedom. I think they're so used to being told, do step 1, do step 2, do this in this order and this many. And that was new. That was a new thing for them. So I'm interested to see how that type of thing progresses as we start to create more learning plans and work out throughout the year, how they start to make more choices on their own about their own learning.
Vicki, I've seen some of the learning plans that you've been submitting in for approval. Can you speak to what you put there in the chat group, just about the choices and the 5th grade response that you're seeing?
Like just when I did the green screen learning plan, for example, like they just really liked being able to choose what what they could do their green screen about, like what they could do a how to, they could research and talk about different places they wanted to visit, or even just like I did the coding learning plan lately, and I was really surprised how many kids wanted to do that paper. They wanted to go get that paper to get the directions rather than watching any of my videos or the slides that I put together. They went and got the paper directions, because then like with the coding, I'm able to offer not just code.org, but they can do Scratch. And for some of them, they like the code.org because it's very sequential and like do this, 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 and this. And for some of them, they're ready to do Scratch because there's more sprites available, there's more behaviors, more things that they can do with it. So I think that just really excites them about it.
Maybe before we go real quick, Casey, can you speak to your checkout there I saw in the chat group?
Yeah, so I'm realizing this year with the types of learners that I have. So there, of course, there's like the independent games that I have on their practice it activities. But I give them choices, whether like sorry, let me get my thoughts together. So when we're going through their learning plan, I will suggest like this might be something you want to do by yourself, but here are some ways where you can practice with a partner and a small group. So even when they're doing the learn about it activities, whether it's a slide deck of YouTube videos or lessons, they can sit with a partner and listen together. It kind of helps with the noise volume in here too. But I'm noticing some like peer tutoring opportunities just happening organically with some of my lower students and some of my average students. So it's worked out really well, giving some of that control to them.
That's awesome. Thank you. And I want to say, as I'm looking at the chat here too, like Malia, I love that we're talking about this. Like, guys, it all kind of comes together, doesn't it? Your vision, your code, and your SOPs. I mean, that's not anything that we had on the agenda to talk about, but I'm seeing how that's integrating into our conversation. You know, Jeremy started off talking about SOPs and like being able to teach them like this is how we solve problems on our Chromebook. Using morning meetings to reflect how things are going, what adjustments do we have to make, and just really like, and you guys hit the nail on the head. Developing independent learners, way easier said than done. But again, in the day and time that we live right now, knowing that at any point you could lose 7 kids out of your classroom as a close contact, if they're able to begin to think like I'm taking ownership of my learning and I have some pieces at home that I can do on my own, like that's a big deal. We struggled when we were in 2019 when we were sent home with remote learning. And I remember specifically at the secondary, if they weren't giving grades, they said, how do we hold them accountable to get the work done? Like that really is like when you have kids that truly have taken ownership of their learning, some of those pieces, some of those problems and obstacles begin to go away. Not easily accomplished. And it's an ongoing process for us to teach our kids that, but it's cool to just hear you guys mentioning those pieces and seeing how important that is. And just noticing it being developed in your classroom is huge. So thank you. Thank you for those checkouts.